Hi there, everyone. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us today. I can see quite a few of you have already come into the chats. That's great. If if you'd like to, it'd be great if you could perhaps introduce yourselves, tell us where in the world you are. That'd be fantastic, and who you are. I think that's always interesting to see where people are tuning in from. A couple of points I have to tell everyone before we get started. So we're recording the session today. So that the recording will be available after we've finished, perhaps later on today or tomorrow morning. So we'll share that out with everyone. And yeah, so I should say, hi, I'm Rob. I'm a developer educator at Flowforge. This is the first time I've done one of these sessions without the support of my colleague Ian, who is much better at these. So hopefully I will do a great job. I apologize in advance if I'm not quite as slick as we usually are at these things, but I'm getting there. You can, as is the point of an Ask Me Anything, you can ask questions. We'd really appreciate it if you would. If you can do that via the Q&A pod, that'd be fantastic, as Nick has already said. I think posted that in the chat. If you ask questions in the chat, they can just get lost in amongst any of the comments that people are giving. So if you can put them in the Q&A pod, we're a lot more likely to make sure none of them get missed. If you do ask questions, there will probably be a chance for you to follow up if you wish to by joining the call. So if we're going through questions, I may send you an invite as where you can jump in. Please don't feel at all obliged to follow up. I know some people don't have microphones or might be in a noisy place, but we found that previously it can be positive, if people want to ask additional questions. So as you can hopefully see on screen, this month's AMA is about debugging in Node-RED. Very happy to have my colleague Nick, as perfect timing on the slide there, Nick, with me today, who's the co-creator of Node-RED, as I think probably a lot of you know, and also the CTO at Flowforge. As I've already said, my name's Rob Marser. I'm a developer educator at Flowforge. And what we're going to talk about today is just some ideas and concepts around debugging of Node-RED flows. So I think I've done everything in the intro. I think I might ask Nick to check that his microphone is also working and say hello.
As long as I unmute myself, that should work.
We can hello.
So I will just say, it's been pointed out, the chat isn't working. It's disabled. And I know we had this in the previous AMA, and Ian, our colleague who normally hosts these, found the option to enable it. We will endeavour to try and find that option ourselves without Ian here to enable it.
I apologise, everyone. I think I've just fixed it. If you could possibly say hello.
Yay, thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, sorry. As I said, first time without my guardian angel, so I won't be quite as slick as Ian is with these.
That's all good. No, it's it's great to see you here, everyone here. I hope interesting session. Unlike previous ones, we've done more general AMAs. This one we've sort of picked a bit more of a focused topic, perhaps around debugging Node-RED flows. So that's kind of the area we're going to hone in a bit more on. So any questions you have on those topics are welcome. But of course, we would welcome questions on any Node-RED topic. Just understand, we're going to focus a bit more on debugging stuff, so we may save some of the other questions towards the end, depending how we get on. But I hope it's interesting. So with all of that said, let me just say I'm also now juggling multiple roles during this webinar. Hopefully my screen is still sharing and you can switch over to a Node-RED instance. So I know we did have some questions were submitted beforehand, so we'll cover those as we go along. But really, really, as I said, the session is about debugging Node-RED flows, and some of this, I suspect, will be stuff that some of you are familiar with. Hopefully there'll be some tips and tricks along the way that are new to you or you've not seen before. But really it's an opportunity for for you guys to ask your questions. If you see something you'd like me to dive in more, then do flag it in the chat or ask your question in the Q&A pod, and yeah, hopefully it will be interesting. So yeah, the topic is debugging flows, and ultimately it's a question of, well, why do you want to be able to debug a flow? Because they don't always behave the way you expect them to. So there are a bunch of nodes, or a handful of nodes in Node-RED, all related to the how can you build flows that cope when things don't go as you expect them to. So we have things like the debug node, which I'm no doubt you are all intimately familiar with, that sends stuff over to the debug sidebar. But there are a few tips and tricks around what you can actually do with the debug node, and some thoughts around sort of strategies for, well, do you just stick a debug node everywhere? And which is a perfectly valid approach, but there are some tricks you can do to try and make that a bit of a better user experience. So yeah, let's work through just some of the basic examples. So as I said, if you're familiar with Node-RED, this won't be too revolutionary to you, but let's just cover the basics for those who perhaps new. So here we've got a simple flow. It's an HTTP endpoint just listening for HTTP GET requests on demo. I just, for the sake of this demo, I just set the payload to some message and I send a response. So in my command window here, I can just go through my history and find the command I want to run. This curl demo, it's done the request, it's got back a response. But we've not had any information inside the editor to tell us about that request. So perhaps we want to dig in a bit more and find out a bit more information about that request. So we can stick in our debug node. And we'll just add a default debug node, deploy it, and then run another request. And there we've got a message in the debug sidebar, but it doesn't really tell us a lot. It's empty. And that's because by default, the debug node is showing you the payload of the message. And because we're doing a GET request, there is nothing in the payload, it's empty. So let's dive into the debug node and look at what some of the options we've got here are. So often you can then switch to complete message object because you want to see not just the payload, but you want to see everything. So let's rerun that. And now straight away, we've got a much more useful bit of information. Again, we can see the payload, it's empty, but now we can start digging into all the other properties that are on the message. And in the case of a HTTP request, you get a lot of stuff. I mean, a bunch of this is kind of internal Node.js type stuff, but it's all there. Often you might want to look at the HTTP headers that have come with the request. So you could come in here and you search through. It's an unordered list. It's kind of the natural order of the properties, and try and find the headers. There's raw headers. In fact, I'm not seeing headers at all, but I'm not seeing headers at all because of a Node.js change. So so they don't show up in the sidebar. That's something we've fixed in the next release of Node-RED. But what we're going to do is say, actually, I do care about the request headers. So if I type in here, show me rec.headers, we get nice autocomplete because it's a commonly used property. And then I rerun the request. So now we've got the object. Here are the message properties. And let's say I want to always debug, or I just want to see this user agent. Okay, well, now I could come back in and think, well, it's rec.headers. And then it's user agent with a hyphen. And so I can't type, because it's JavaScript, I can't have properties with a hyphen. So now I've got to think about, I kind of have to know that I have to use the brackets. It's a bit of a pain. Well, with the debug sidebar, we've got these options over here. And this first option, the copy path option, if I click that, it has copied to my clipboard the full path to this property. So if I come in here and I delete that and I just paste from my clipboard, it has automatically generated the proper string to put in there to access that property of the message. And that's useful not just for debug. If you're using the change node and you want to set properties or read properties, that same trick works. The debug node lets you just copy the exact path to that that property, even when here I'm debugging, sort of digging into the message, it gives me that whole path. So that's useful. So let's just deploy that and see that do something. So now we get just the value of that header. No doubt, if we go back and look at message.rec, rec being request. I say there's a whole bunch of properties in here. I'm just trying to think what else is useful to. Well, in fact, there's probably not for the types of things I want to show you right now. I'm going to switch to this second flow. So now this is using an HTTP post endpoint. So now I can start sending data into Node-RED. So let's just clear the sidebar. And this is where I'm going to use another curl command I prepared earlier. Don't worry about the details. It's just a convenient way. Well, in fact, I'll tell you what this is doing. This is using the GitHub command line. It's going and getting the list of 10 issues from our GitHub issue tracker in JSON. And then I'm just posting that data into my Node-RED flow. So this HTTP endpoint, it's just listening for posts. I've already got this debug node, default configuration, display the payload. And so here you can see I've got an array of the 10 issues that are open. The 10 most recent open issues on our issue tracker. So, let's start thinking, well, what might we want to be able to do with that? A topic that came up in a previous AMA was around looping and how you might want to examine lots of bits of data. So one way of doing that, and a sort of typical node array, so we're receiving this array of objects. Let's say we want to do something for each of these things that gets posted. So a very typical pattern would be split node and then a join node as a sort of a pair of functions, which the split node will take that one message and split it into 10 individual messages that will flow across this wire. And then the join node will package them back up into one. So if I add another debug node down here, and I'm just going to clear that sidebar, and if I submit it again, so now you can see we've got lots more debug messages going on. So we've still got this first debug coming from this debug, and it's worth saying if you're ever unsure where a message has come from, you just hover over its name here, and it sort of tells you exactly what flow. If I hover, what flow it's on and what node, and you can actually click on that, and it highlights in the workspace the debug node it's come from. Something which, and we'll come to these flows in a minute, but it doesn't matter where you are clicking on that, it will switch to the workspace and it will reveal the debug node, which is super useful, particularly when, for example, you've got subflows. Sometimes trying to work out which node logged a message can be a bit tricky, but the debug sidebar does try and help you track down where messages have come from. So now we've got to this point of we've got multiple messages flowing through. We can now do tasks on individual messages. For example, we can You know, I was planning to demo something that I've forgotten is in the next release of Node that we haven't released yet, and this is the current release. So I was building up to demo something that I can't actually demo right now. But there is, in the next release of Node, there is an option here to display a count of messages that a debug node has received, which again is useful when you're debugging flows and you want to sort of see some sense of activity where things are flowing through. Okay, so I mean, again, this is a lot of sort of quite rudimentary debug node type activity. There are, I'm just trying to think what is a useful thing. Oh,
just one thing, Nick, sorry, that I found. So we're doing the split and join, and the first time I ever used that, it just seemed like magic to me, the way it managed to reconstruct the data on the other side. But if you change the debugs to the debug 3 to show the full message object, it actually shows you the information which has been appended to each one of those messages, which allows the join to function. And I've then used that to actually manually define things to be joined back together. So there's quite often, if you're trying to understand some things which perhaps aren't surfaced in the interface, you will find a lot more information using the debugging, going as you did earlier, Nick, right down to the message level.
Absolutely
helps you understand how things are happening. Yeah,
and in fact that's a really useful prompt, because I was trying to think what's a useful thing to do next, and this is a useful thing to do next. So just as you described, I've changed this debug node to show the complete message object, and you can now see my message has this parts property, and this is all the metadata that the split and join nodes use in order to do their work. So it actually tells you what type of message have we split. Well, it was an array. There were 10 elements in that array, and that this is index 0, as in this is the first message in that array. And if we come down to some random one down here, you can see this one's got an index of 5. This is starting at 0. So this is the 6th message in the array. So there's always a lot of useful information. Now, you might notice all these messages by default are collapsed, which if you're trying to debug and there's a particular message property you want to look at, it can be a bit of a pain. But with what you can do, if we just come back to these tools alongside the message property, we have this option to pin. So let's say we want to see the count. If I click that to pin it open and refresh and then send another request, then you can see the debug sidebar has automatically expanded the message. So I haven't, we expanded the message to make sure the pinned property is visible and automatically expanded. Now you might say, well, I could have just changed the debug node to only show me that property, but often you want to see that property, but without losing the ability to then go and look at the other properties of that message. So pinning is helpful if you find yourself having to constantly expand. And then I'm trying to remember, there is an option and I've gone blank in my head. Oh, there it is. So this drop down does give you options to collapse the message, but also to clear the pinned paths. So if you've got lots of pins, you don't have to go and turn each one off individually. You can let you clear the pinned paths. But that's super useful. Then there are tips and tricks around filtering. So if you've got lots of debug nodes, you've got a stream of information going on, there are various ways you can filter. By default, it will show debug messages from wherever they're coming from. You can filter it down to only show debug messages from the current flow that you're looking at. You can do it based on selected nodes. So you can turn on or off everything depending what you want to see. Now, it's not perfect in the sense that this is just filtering what is shown in the browser. all those messages are still being sent to the browser, and there's the debug sidebar still has a limit of how many messages it can hold, whether it's filtered or not. So you can get a slightly unexpected behavior if you're sending lots of data to the debug sidebar and you enable filtering. Then if you're looking at a flow that sends messages very rarely, and you've got another flow that's sending a lot, you may find yourself, the messages you're trying to look at get cleared off the sort of the stack of messages because other messages have come in and pushed them off the back. It's a tricky problem that we've never quite found the perfect solution to. So in terms of a debug strategy, something to always consider is, well, one is don't leave debug nodes lying around if you don't really need them. The other is deactivate the debug nodes. So the difference between filtering, as I say, the filter just applies in the web browser. All of the data is still being sent, but by deactivating the debug node, by clicking its button, that turns it off in the runtime. So the node won't capture any, won't be doing any work to log the information in the runtime. So that's, again, one of those strategies of thinking of, okay, how do I add debug? But yeah, I don't want to have to keep adding the debug nodes each time I come in, but nor do I want the overhead of those debug nodes sat there when I'm not really using them. So deactivating debug nodes is a good trick. So something else available in the debug nodes, let's have a look. So something that we've had a little while, but I suspect doesn't get a lot of use, is actually the ability to use a JSON expression in the output of the debug node. So let's, so I wasn't sure which node I opened up there. So let's look at, let's say for example, right, I'm going to turn off that debug node. I'm going to open this one. I'm going to go back to showing message.payload for the moment. And let's just fire in the data so we can see them. So here we've got all of our messages with this object with the issue information in, but it's 3 different properties. And perhaps for the sake of debug, I want to see something that's a bit more consumable in the sidebar without it taking up all that space. So if we switch to a JSON expression, then what we can do is use JSON to actually build up exactly what we want to show in the sidebar. So, for example, let's say we wanted to convert that object into a single string with all that information. So we would want the number, and this is where we use the JSON string concatenation, which is the ampersand symbol. Let's do, for example, that. So we're going to build up payload.number with a colon and then the title. All good. So let's deploy that. So now when I trigger the flow, rather than the object, it's now given me that sort of reformatted version. Now I could have done that with a function node before the debug node. That's a perfectly valid way of doing it. But this does mean, frankly, it means fewer nodes in your flow just related to debug. If that's debug information, you can just present it there. Other options, node status. Oh, there we are. There's message count. I knew it was hiding somewhere. So let's enable that. So node status, those little messages that appear below the node, if we enable that, again, we can just run through those options via that. Now, you can see the status. Because we've fired through 10 messages, then actually it's just showing us the last one that happens to have passed through. But in this instance, we can enable the message count option. So you can see it's got a count of 0. I run this flow, and now, before I could switch back to the window, it's gone up to 10. Useful if you do want to just get a sense of well, how many messages have gone through this flow without me having to go and count this sidebar to see how many got logged. So again, all these little bits of how can I get more meta information and extra information in the debug. We often say, the editor isn't intended to be a dashboard. So this is very much aligned to the sort of information you want when you're trying to debug what the flows are doing.
Is there any way to reset that number, Nick, other than doing a deploy?
There is not in this version of Node-RED, and I think that may be what made me pause when I said I was going to demo this and I couldn't find the option. I think in 3.1 we may have added an ability to reset that count. I can't remember off the top of my head. We can double check that, but yeah, as it stands, that number does get reset whenever the flows are redeployed. I think we did add an option that if you passed in a message to reset it, it got reset. I think one of the challenges is there's not quite an intuitive UI in the editor to trigger a reset of that number. So, but it's something we can iterate on. Okay, so that's a lot about the debug node. I'm just glancing over at the questions. Please do, if people have got do have any questions along the way, please do fire them in. But something else I wanted to talk about a little bit about is handling errors, because often debug is about understanding what's going on in your flows, and often, when your flows don't behave as they might. So I want to talk a little bit about the catch node and what role it plays in all of this, because typically, you want to debug when something's not working. Well, if your flow can detect something's not working, then that gives you a better fighting chance to do something about it, or perhaps do some extra debug type work. So here I've got a simple flow that I inject a function, and inside this function, I just do a node.error, something went wrong. And as you can see, I have that message over in the sidebar. The problem is there's absolutely no way for my flow to do anything about that. It's just going to get put in the log and rely on you spotting that message at some point to know something went wrong. And this is where it all depends on how you use node.error. If you just pass in a message, then it gets logged as an error message, and that's it. However, if when you use node.error, if you pass in message, as in, well, a message object as the second argument, then that will do, that does something else. So in fact, what I might just do for the sake of this demo is if I just, so I'm just turning off this catch node, I'm disabling it so it doesn't interfere. So pretend that catch node's not there. Well, don't need to pretend it isn't there, it's been disabled from the runtime. Now when I log this one, you can see it's still logged the error in the sidebar because I've done a node.error, something went wrong. But the crucial point is, because I have passed in the message as a second argument, I now have the ability to use a catch node with it. And by adding a catch node, and this is the default, it's going to catch any errors in this flow. If I now deploy that and trigger it, notice I don't get, in fact, in case I was too quick, so I've cleared the debug sidebar. Now if I trigger it, notice I don't get any error message printed. But I now get from a debug node, in fact, you can see which debug node it's coming from. It's coming out of this debug node attached to the catch node, because the catch node has caught the error and the message has now been sent from this node, giving me a chance to do something about it. And as before, if we switch to the complete message object, and if I trigger it and we expand, so the payload is the timestamp, which is what the inject node said. But because it's come out of a catch node, we have this error property. And there you can see, there is the message that was logged with this error. And here's a source telling me this is the ID, the type, and also the count, because if you can get stuck in error loops, and this count will slowly increase if it finds itself in a loop. But with all the information about what the error was and where it came from. So that actually gives you a fighting chance to build a flow. If there's certain errors that you are sort of sensitive to, that you are aware that a node might log, then you can actually build your flows to handle those programmatically. And that information is provided to help you do that. So that's the catch node. And that's kind of a lot about the debug node. I mean, other tricks and tips, for example, the status node. So let me just think. This isn't one I've prepared earlier, but so in fact, what I'm going to do is switch back to this flow. So here we have this is our flow that is going to print out those 10 messages. I'm going to add in a status node. And by default, this is then paying attention to all of the status messages under all of the nodes in this workspace. Just as with, for example, the catch node, by default, it examines, it is listening for errors from everyone. With the catch node, you can tell it to actually only listen for errors from particular nodes. So if in a single flow you have different nodes that might log different errors, you can actually add catch nodes targeting just the nodes that you want. So you can have different error handling for different nodes in your workspace. So same as the status, you can target different nodes. So this might get a little noisy, but so here I've got a status node tied to debug. If I trigger this flow, and instead of, I'm just going to, rather than send 10 messages, I'm just going to send 3 just to make it a bit less noisy. So here we have, an slightly intriguing result, which I was not necessarily expecting. So here we have, you know what, this is very curious. I think we may have found a bug, ladies and gentlemen, with the status node. So what I was expecting was, in fact, let's have a look. We change that to complete message object. So the status node should send a message every time the status of a node changes. So, okay, that's clear. Oh, no, we haven't hit a bug. Well, we've hit something. So let's look at these messages coming out of the status node. So they have a status property. And here you can see it tells, here is the status object saying, well, the status of this node is a blue ring with the text 4. And again, the source telling us which node logged that status. So debug 3, that all lines up. And here we have another one with text 6. What's intriguing is I don't know where status 5 has got to. So that's it might be the status updates so rapidly, and there might be a bit of caching going on. So we'll take a look at that. But this is useful when, for example, you have, let's say, the MQTT node. Now, this is where I am going to just trying to think how best to demonstrate this to you. I have got, I have an MQTT broker running on, beg your pardon, force of habit, local. So I have an MQTT broker running locally, and I'm just going to configure this MQTT node to subscribe to foo. And if I deploy that, straight away, you can see I've received a status message in which if I expand that, you can see I've received the status event from that node saying the node is connected. That, because of the way we do translations, the text is a message catalog identifier, but the point is it says connected. So if you wanted to build flows that handled errors around handle errors around losing its connection, well, this status node is now listening to this bit of text below the node. So if that MQTT node loses its connection, it will fire a disconnected, and you'll get a message so you could take some sort of action. And indeed, when it reconnected, you'd get another status message. So that's a good technique for, it's a bit beyond debugging flows, but building flows that can be more resilient to things that can go on. So yeah, any node that reports status about its behavior, you can build flows that tap into that. So I see a question from Tony about how do you temporarily disable any node, not just the debug node. So that's absolutely. Let me, sorry, just tidy this up so it doesn't complain every time we deploy. Excuse me. So what you can do is every single node in the bottom of its edit dialog, it has this enabled, disabled toggle. And if you disable a node, then it changes its appearance like that. And that, when I next deploy, so you, unlike the debug node's toggle, which sort of takes effect immediately, doing that disable, you then have to deploy. That effectively means that node doesn't exist. But crucially, it also means nor do these wires. So it doesn't, it's not the case that it sort of removes the node from the flow and the wire then messages just pass through as if it wasn't there. It acts more like a break between the two. Now, there have been discussions in the community forum about having a mode where it might be nice to be able to detach the node from the wire, or disable it in a way as if, and then the wire sort of just continues underneath it. But that isn't something we have today. So yes, you can disable the node. I will say a tip for Node-RED for uncovering so much stuff that you may not be familiar with is, for one thing, in the current release and more in the next release, 3.1, is the right-click menu starts to unlock more of the options. But this show action list option, this gives you a long list of a lot of the actions you can do in Node-RED. So if you pull that up and search, for example, disable, here you can say disable selected nodes, and that will do it. So for example, if you select lots of nodes and we do a disable selected nodes, that will disable all the ones you've had selected, and likewise enable selected flows, nodes. And whilst we're on that topic, everything in this list, this action list, you can see we've got keyboard shortcuts against some of them. Everything in this list, you can assign your own custom keyboard shortcuts to. So from the main menu, the keyboard shortcuts, here we have that list. So if I look for disable selected nodes, here you could assign your own keyboard shortcut to it if it's something you wanted to be able to do routinely. And that's a great tip, just generally discovering a lot of the stuff you can do in Node-RED that might not be, well, yeah, you kind of have to discover it's there, and that's a great way of finding stuff. Okay, let's see. A question from Mark on debugging related, because I cannot figure out why Node does not send MQTT messages properly with the retain flag. Okay, that's perhaps a bit deep in the detail of the MQTT node than we want to get into right now. but if that's something we can follow up on, I would, well, I certainly believe that works properly. I have used that successfully, so I think we'd want to dig in a bit more on that particular scenario, quite specific to debugging the node itself, which I think is a bit beyond our scope right now.
We have some other questions, Nick, that came in beforehand. If you'd like me to go into those, would that be?
Yeah. So yes, let's cover those. That would be.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So a question from Ben. Actually, Ben sent in quite a few questions. So thanks, Ben. I think I can see you on the call as well. So, how to only fire the debug node when a condition is met. Example, I get hundreds of aircraft messages per minute. Only one of those will cause the error. How to catch the bad message?
So it's going to very much depend on whether you can detect the error and exactly in what context that error is happening. So whilst the debug node doesn't have any conditional logic, and in fact that would be a really interesting feature for the debug node to look at, would be to have some sort of conditional operator saying, only log if a certain condition is met. The way you would achieve that today would be the good old switch node ahead of the debug node as kind of a gating filter. So here we would have again, so it all depends what you can do to try and detect that bad message. So let's in fact, I'm just going to so let's deploy what we've got, and I'm just going to trigger that flow. Oh, but I'm going to, let's grab payload.number, for example. So let's say I only want to see what if payload.number, maybe I only really care about issue 2113. So it's a switch node. It's just going to do that filtering. If I clear the sidebar and now run it. So now, it's only that switch node has now filtered out all the messages I don't care about. So the debug will then just show that one. How you detect what you want to debug or not will very much depend on the scenario and whether it's something a switch node can be used to filter, or perhaps it might need a function node if it's kind of some sort of validation on the message. It might be in your flow, for example, you rather than do it as a filter in line, you're doing processing on the message, and then maybe you do just write the code saying number equals, say, 2113. Oops, we expect that to be a string. Then in fact, what we can do is let's add 2 outputs to this function. Then we'll do a node.send null on the first output, message on the second, else return we'll just return message, which will send it on the first output. So node.send passes on the message, but by passing it an array, this first item is the first output, the second one is the second output. So now we have our 2 outputs, and I just wire up that second output. And now when I run, I don't get any messages because I have made a mistake somewhere. This is where it's going to be something super obvious, and I don't immediately see it. Second output, message over. well, good example. Let's debug our flow. So we're going to stick a node.warn message payload.number. Have I got that right? We run it. So we get 2124, 2113, 2103. It's because good old JavaScript. They aren't strings. It is an actual number, I believe. Yeah, there we are. So we have successfully pulled out a message, and in this instance, just because of its number, and we've passed it to debug. Otherwise, everything else has just passed straight on through, and the flow's continued as normal. So yeah, that's one way of doing it. Whilst we're talking about the function node, I do see a question from Fraser, and I think I seem to remember this was a question from Ben as well. Right now, we don't have, well, I say right now, we do not have the ability to do sort of stepwise debugging through the code inside a function node. The way the function node works, we can't get that level of debugger access to how the runtime evaluates the code inside a function node. So that is something we don't have, and I don't see a clean path through being able to do that at the moment. But you know, never say never. We do have the ability, and this might be an interesting segue, but please do jump in, Rob, if there are questions from the community that I should.
There are questions, but I think I know what you're going to talk about, and I found it really interesting when I found it out. So go on, please. Okay.
Well, yeah, if people have conscious, we've got about 12 minutes left. So if people have burning questions, please do put them in the chat, and I will endeavor to at least have 3 or 4 minutes at the end to speed run your questions as best I can. But where I wanted to, and this is probably going to be less familiar because it isn't installed by default, but I want to talk about the Node-RED debugger. So this is an optional extra thing you can install. If you search the Palette Manager, you'll find Node-RED debugger. Now, this is a Node-RED plugin rather than a set of nodes. So after you install it via the Palette Manager, you do need to restart Node-RED to get it to reload properly. That's just a current state of Node-RED and its plugins. But once you've installed Node-RED debugger, and restarted Node-RED, you get this new sidebar called the flow debugger. By default, it's disabled, but I can come along and I can enable it. And then you get this view of breakpoints and messages. So once it's enabled, when I hover over any port, you can see you get this little light blue lozenge. And in fact, I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And by clicking on that, it goes solid. And you can now see it's listed over here as a breakpoint. And what that acts as is like a breakpoint in traditional coding. When I trigger this flow, as soon as a message hits that breakpoint, the runtime is paused. And you can see here, flow's paused, and all the nodes show that they're paused. And you can see we've got this 3 on this breakpoint, which tells us there are currently 3 messages queued up on this port of the node, all ready to be sent. And over here, I can actually inspect them. So just like the debug sidebar, it shows me the complete message object. I can actually see what messages are queued up at that point. And when we talk about step debugging, I can actually click the step flows button, and it's taken the next message off the queue and processed it. And in this instance, it's taken it from the split node and it's passed it to the function node. And if we look at our message queue, you can now see that message has arrived at the function node. And so as we step through, each time I click, you can see messages moving through the flow one at a time. And there you can see that first message has gone to that first output. Our next message is the one that the function node was looking for. So you can see that has generated two messages, one on the top output and one on the bottom output. And you can continue stepping through, just following each message. And then you can also do interesting things like saying, well, actually, this message here, oh, don't mean to turn on a deep breakpoint. Then this message here, that you can show here, I don't want that to go any further. So I can actually delete that message and it's no longer in the runtime. So that's sometimes you might have a poison message going through a flow and you want to stop it. You can reach in and delete that message and it no longer exists in the runtime. And then I can hit play and just all the messages carry on as they were. And there are other options. For example, by default, it pauses the whole runtime. You can swap it to only pause at the breakpoint. So now when I trigger it, you can see only this node is paused. And say if I come over here, I can still be triggering these flows. These nodes aren't paused, but this split node is. And then if I go back to the flow debugger, if I step forward, it's now pausing the nodes that those messages I'm stepping hit. So again, a way to start debugging your flows whilst perhaps you want to have other bits of the flows left uninterrupted. So that's the flow debugger. Again, there's a whole bunch of possible functionality we would like to get to, such as it would be nice perhaps to be able to reach in and modify a message. So not just remove it, but also reach in here and say, well, let's test what happens if this number property says something different, it's a different number, or help you test different scenarios by manually editing the messages in the flow. Also having conditional breakpoints. We talked a bit about conditional debug, being able to place some sort of condition that only trigger the breakpoint if the message meets some criteria, for example. So you would be able to Ben's question about spotting a message that is garbled, being able to add a breakpoint that only gets triggered if the message is garbled, for example. So Ben asks, is there a hit on the runtime performance when you enable the debugger? Yes, there is the runtime is having to do a bit more work just to check if a message arriving at a port hits a breakpoint or not. That is a small overhead. So you wouldn't typically want to be running the debugger on your live production system unattended, because of course, if a breakpoint gets triggered, then it's going to stop your flows running until you resume them. So yes, there is a small overhead, but I've certainly tried to implement it to make that overhead as small as possible. But as with all debug techniques, they always come at a slight trade-off between performance and the ability to dive into your flows. So yeah, that's the flow debugger. Like I said, we published last year. I'm keen for us to try and do more to promote it in the community and find a way to keep adding to its functionality, because I think it holds a lot of promise. And it's already super useful. We just need to get more people knowing about it. So
yeah, the way I came, I think you told me about that, Nick, because previously I'd been using a QGate node, which allows you to store messages and then release them either manually or via a loop. So I would have been using that in a similar way. So I could then release messages one by one and see exactly what's going on. And this just seemed like, whereas then I would then have to rip out all of those nodes to turn it back to its production state. So maybe you then break something by virtue of those edits. This allows you to keep it a lot cleaner. So yeah, I think it's
because any time I can just hit disable and the flows are resumed instantly, and you're back to normal. So, and I will say that question about performance hit, it is implemented so that when it's disabled, it is completely removed from the messaging path. So there is zero overhead having it installed. It's only when you click enabled that it adds the hooks in the runtime to monitor for breakpoints. So yeah, it's again, we've tried to implement it to be as efficient as possible, considering what it has to do, but there is zero overhead having it installed if it's disabled.
I think that might be, we don't have any more questions. Ben, I know you'd asked some questions previously. I have a feeling that Nick has touched on most of them. I'm pretty sure. I think potentially all of them. I don't know if you want to have a look, Nick, if you've got access to those, but I mean, we're a couple of minutes away from the end of the session anyway. And yeah, it seemed like a good idea to wrap up if that's, unless there's anything else you want to talk about, Nick.
No, I think, I mean, hopefully that's been useful. It's a bit of debug 101, but I think as with Node-RED, there are so many just little features that have been there a long time, but unless you spend time clicking around and exploring, you don't necessarily find. I mean, I didn't even mention turning on logging to the system console, which again, if you're running Node-RED unattended and you haven't got the editor open, enabling the system console will mean you can just look in the Node-RED logs for the debug information. If something goes wrong overnight and you didn't have your browser open, again, a useful technique. And yeah, from my perspective, it's always great to run through this stuff. It's even better to get the feedback from you lot who are real Node-RED users in terms of what is missing. I think conditional debug is a good topic, and I think we should make sure we've got that captured on the Node-RED backlog to be looked at. And yeah, I could waffle on about this stuff for hours and hours and hours, but in the interests of not doing that and keeping this to time, I will thank you all for attending, and I will let Rob wrap us up.
Yes, thanks, Nick. I mean, just a couple of things I wanted to say. Just wanted to plug the company we work for, Flowforge, just a little bit for a few seconds. Flowforge provides an environment where you can run Node-RED. It's great for teams of people who want to collaborate. We have a cloud offering. Also, it's something that's entirely open source, so you can run it yourself. Just mention that today we've had our 1.7 release, and a big part of that is that Flowforge has the ability to deploy Node-RED out to your own devices. So if you have Raspberry Pis or whatever it might be, it can deploy code out there. And what we've enabled today, which I think is fantastic, is you can now, from Flowforge, go and edit those flows. So it brings us back to, we've been talking about debugging. So now you can go and debug what's actually going on in that Raspberry Pi that might be attached to some machinery, with sensors or whatever it might be. So it allows you to go and debug things locally on there. And then also on that point, if you want to try out Flowforge Cloud, you can go to flowforge.com. You can use an instance of Node-RED for 30 days for free. So please go and give it a try. See what you can build with Flowforge. That'd be fantastic. And that's it, really. That's the message from our sponsor, so to speak. I don't know if it Fraser's just asked a question. I don't know if you want to pick up on that. I mean, we can run over by a minute or.
I will just say, absolutely, yeah, the logs are available. Although I'm unsure why they are not loading for me in my local development. I will say this is my local development, so I have a lot of unreleased code going on here. And if I just pull up one of my other Node-RED instances. No, sorry, I just went and did the same one. Hanging Node-RED, let's look at that one. So yes, you can reach the Node-RED logs. And here you can see a Node-RED flow that every 2 seconds is printing out its timestamp. So yes, you can get to the console output of Node-RED via the Node-RED logs side of things.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your questions and the positive feedback in the chat. That's fantastic. We have things that are coming up, sorry, that I should just mention. So I'm going to do a webinar about using Node-RED Dashboard in a couple of weeks' time. So the registration for that's up on our website. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please register. Hopefully I will show you some cool tricks you can do with Dashboard on that session. But yeah, thanks for joining us. And we'll catch you all soon. Okay.
Yep. So Mark just quickly asked, the link is, or let me just, as soon as we close the webinar, the chat's going to disappear. So if you just go to flowforge.com,
resources and then webinar, I think it is. Yeah.
It's a resource. Yeah.
It will appear on that banner at the top as well as soon as I go and change that. So yes, it'll be at the top of the home.
Well, there you go. You've got about 30 seconds before Rob kills the Zoom link, but the link is in chat. The upcoming webinar, you'll be able to register. Right. Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.